Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Sri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Shayam Rupa Garamayam Dharati Shapadantikam. Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Shamiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharini Vishesha Shinivare Paschati Rasatani. Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhabhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So today, which is this morning in the US and probably midday in Europe, and probably around 4:30 in India, 5 o'clock in India, in the evening, we're continuing a discussion on the topic of dissatisfaction. Now, just yesterday I was thinking about something that maybe I didn't speak about last week, but I think it's good, as a good point. Welcome to all of you who are here and who are coming. Prabhupada once said that the goal of life is to be happy. And so one time they were discussing living off the land, and Kirtanananda Swami said, Srila Prabhupada, it's a lot of work. Because Prabhupada would sometimes say, you can grow food for a few months and then you have most of the time free. So you can engage that free time in spiritual life. And then Kirtanananda Maharaj was saying, it's a lot of work, and sometimes people are working harder. And they were talking about how Prabhupada was mentioning how hard they work in the city. So Kirtananda was saying, well, some farmers work very hard. And Prabhupada said, but are they happy? So that was kind of the criteria. All right, you want to work hard in the city, but are you happy? So then one time Prabhupada was asked, what's the purpose of life? And he was said the purpose is to be happy. But of course, Prabhupada meant be happy in Krishna consciousness. So I just want to clarify that I'm welcoming all, I'm looking at all of the names as they're coming up, as you're coming on, so I get a little distracted. So when Prabhupada said, well, the goal of life is to be happy, Prabhupada meant happy in Krishna consciousness. And most people, non-devotees, would think the goal of life is to be happy. And at least in America, what they say is that, do your own thing, be happy, just don't hurt anybody else. But I think one of the things they don't realize is that in their attempt to be happy, most of the time they're hurting themselves. They may not be hurting anyone else directly, unless they're eating meat, or we may not realize the ramifications of how we're hurting people because of the products we buy. But in terms of what we can perceive, the idea is, well, I just go about my life doing what makes me happy and I don't hurt anybody. And that's kind of, that becomes kind of the, standard. That's considered like what everybody should do, what everybody's doing. Just be happy. And so when Prabhupada says be happy, it comes with some disclaimer. Disclaimer means read the fine print, because just trying to be happy is not really the goal. Because the reality is that if we become happy in ways that degrade us, then how could the goal just be to be happy? And I think a lot of people don't look at it this way. So Krishna describes happiness in the three modes of nature, and then there's transcendental happiness. And the happiness in the three modes of nature comes with various ramifications. And the quality of the happiness is different in each mode. So if the goal is just to be happy, then I could be happy as an alcoholic or a drug addict. So obviously that happiness degrades me. So then we can't say, well, the goal is to be happy, but we have to say the goal would be to be happy in a way that purifies me, that uplifts me, that benefits me, and that doesn't harm the planet and doesn't harm anybody else. Now, so many things we do to become happy are harming the planet. So that's a big one. If we say be happy without harming the planet, and be happy without harming yourself, then we as devotees would say that probably much of what people are doing is harming themselves in the name of happiness, because it's taking them away from Krishna. So if your happiness is taking you away from Krishna, then in the end, you'll get another body, probably not as good as this life, probably not with the opportunity to be Krishna conscious. So that happiness is degrading you. So in that sense, being happy, just the goal of being happy, doesn't necessarily work, because the consequence of that goal, either immediately or in the future, could cause you a lot of unhappiness. So when I talk to people about happiness, I say that you have to look at happiness on a continuum. In other words, what am I doing now? Okay, right now this is making me happy, but will what you're doing now make you happy a year from now, or next week, or in a minute? And a lot of people don't look at it that way. So if I was to do an equation and say, let's look at what I'm doing now and how much happiness it gives me, and let's look at all the ramifications and the levels of happiness or the degree of happiness that this one activity is going to give me a month from now, a year from now. I just heard, and then you add it all up, and you'll see a lot of what's called happiness, if you add it all up, it doesn't last. It's not sustainable. So it's not really happiness. And I just heard some research about this, and they said that whatever you do, and we understand this is just, I don't know how valid this research is, but they say that whatever you do, 3 months later, it has absolutely no effect on you. So like, you can have amazing experiences of happiness, and it'll have absolutely no consequence on your life in 3 months. Now, in Krishna consciousness, it's not like that. Your happiness is purifying you. So it does have consequences, because it's gradually getting you closer to Krishna. But for non-devotees, they say, okay, I did this, it made me happy. But will that contribute to your overall happiness? Will that contribute to purifying your consciousness? Will that contribute to your progress in life in a way that it brings you even greater happiness in the future? The answer in most cases, if not all cases, unless it's spiritual, would be no. So everything you're doing now, if you're not a devotee, everything you're doing now for happiness, in a few months will have no effect on you. That level of happiness will not bring you anything. Now, compare that to Krishna consciousness. Everything you're doing is purifying you. So 3 months later, it will have an effect, because it uplifts your consciousness. So, and I think one of the things that is most clear for non-devotees is to explain that the level of your consciousness is what affects your happiness more than anything. I think we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I was thinking about this not yesterday, last week, this problem is that sometimes society defines what is happiness. And therefore, you could be happy, but if you buy into their definition, then even if you're happy, you become unhappy, because you don't qualify by their standards to be happy, or what happiness. In other words, I could be fine, but then someone says, well, to be happy, you need a job on this level, you need this certain amount of money, you need a family, you need a house this size, you need these certain things. And you may look at yourself and say, I don't have those things. And not having those things could make you feel unhappy, because now you've been conditioned to believe that happiness exists within certain things or within a certain standard. So even though maybe you're happy, you can reflect and think, but I don't have those things. So that could make you unhappy. You understand? It's like, I may be a happy person who could be conditioned or programmed to be unhappy once I start comparing myself to other people who are supposed to be happy, who have the things that are supposed to make you happy. So now, even though I was happy, I'm not happy because I'm not supposed to be happy until I have all these things. I mean, that sounds stupid, right? But it happens that someone starts feeling unhappy, or even feeling, well, there must be something wrong with me that I'm happy without all the things society says will make me happy. Maybe I have things wrong. That's unfortunate. So that's going on more and more. We're programmed into a standard. We have to have certain things. I was once in Los Angeles. We were living there, and we had a little apartment, and then we started furnishing it. And I told my wife, we don't really need much. She said, yeah, I know, but everybody else has it. So because everyone else has it, I kind of feel like I should have it. So it's like that. You look at the neighbors and what they have, and you think, everybody thinks the neighbors are happier than they are. And so they're trying to think, okay, well, what do they have that I don't have? That must be why they're happy. So, yeah, that's another interesting concept. Now, but the point I wanted to make when we're explaining this to non-devotees, that one of the most powerful points, I believe, is to explain, of course, as we understand, happiness is not achieved through acquisition, but happiness is achieved through purification of consciousness, or happiness is achieved through elevating your consciousness, or ultimately happiness is achieved through becoming God conscious. But if you just use a general idea that happiness is achieved by raising consciousness, not by material achievements or material acquisition, then it's very easy to understand, for people to understand and for ourselves to understand, that if we're doing something in the name of happiness, which may give us happiness in the moment, but it's not elevating our consciousness, then it's doing nothing to contribute to our what we could say, permanent state of happiness. It's doing nothing to contribute to our normal state of happiness. So, if I do something that elevates my consciousness, then I get to experience whatever it is that my consciousness is experiencing, which is kind of obvious. It's simple, although a lot of people don't get this. If I do something to degrade my consciousness, I have to experience it. I have to experience that also. And that's why Lord Buddha said you're punished by your anger. You're punished by your resentment. You're punished by your envy, your jealousy. Anything like that, we're punished by. It's a kind of self-punishment. But if we elevate ourselves, even if we don't have compassion, but we live with compassion, and we try to manifest it, or we try to manifest any virtue, tolerance, patience, kindness, we manifest it by acting on it, even before we have it. Hare Krishna, Dan. You must be in Hawaii, otherwise it's kind of early if you're in San Diego. So when we manifest any of these qualities, we get to experience the pleasure or the satisfaction in this case, because this class we're talking about is about dissatisfaction. We get to manifest the satisfaction of the virtue that we're living because it's a state of consciousness. And that state of consciousness is not dependent on any kind of position or acquisition. It's your own consciousness. Krishna Karshani is saying, can you be Krishna conscious and unhappy? No. Only unhappy that other people aren't Krishna conscious, but personally not unhappy, because we heard a quote yesterday where Prabhupada said, if you're not happy, you're not a devotee. A devotee means happy, because a devotee he's above all the actions and levels of consciousness that would make you unhappy. Of course, as a conditioned devotee, sometimes we struggle, so any kind of struggle might make us unhappy. But even as a devotee, if you're unhappy, you can take prasadam and be happy, you can chant and be happy, you can read, be happy, you can always, your existential situation may be challenging, but you can always do things that make you happy. So I think one of the biggest points that the world is not getting is that your state of consciousness is what has the most influence on your level of happiness, because your state of consciousness, it's a constant. And happiness, which is derived circumstantially from situations, or happiness which is derived from sensual pleasure, it doesn't elevate your consciousness unless that activity was actually elevating. And in most cases, it's not. And so therefore, that's why the research says that whatever happiness you achieved 3 months later, you have no experience of it. It has no effect on you. It has no influence on you. Whereas the devotional service you do, it always has an influence on you. It always, and what's interesting about it is that whatever devotional service you do, if you stop doing it, and then again you take up Krishna consciousness, your advancement is there. You immediately tap into it. It's like a bank account. Whereas material happiness, it's like you're depositing in the bank account, but it's being taxed. And when you go back months later, there's nothing there. That happiness that you derived from all the pleasure in your life, years later, it may have had a very detrimental effect on your consciousness. So you don't experience it. And so I think this is a big point that people don't realize, because people are all looking for happiness in the moment. Oh, let's do something, have a great time. And they do experience happiness. But then a little bit later, a few days later, a week later, as it's said here, 3 months later, there's nothing. So, and you're left with who you are as a person. You're left with your own state of consciousness, your own level of spiritual purification. That's what you're left with to enjoy, because ultimately we're always with ourselves. And so, some people, they don't like themselves, and some people don't like to be alone. Hare Krishna Kamaniya. Hare Krishna. So some people, I don't want to be alone. And if you have a very low consciousness, you wouldn't want to be alone. A person in Krishna consciousness, they always feel Krishna's presence. They always feel the presence of their guru, and they always feel their own consciousness. Sometimes I joke, but it's actually true. I said, if you want good association all the time, be good association for yourself. So if you have high consciousness, then you're good association for yourself. And then being alone, not that we should be alone all the time, but being alone sometimes would be very pleasing. You're very happy to be with yourself. So that's important. And that's something that's missing in our society today, tremendously missing. And that's why everybody is thinking and acting in a way that they're pretty much convinced that happiness and pleasure lies in gratifying one of the 5 senses, or the mind, gratifying the mind. And it's true, like we might say there's no happiness there, but actually Krishna doesn't say that. He just says there's happiness there, but the consequence of that happiness turns sour. So Krishna doesn't say there's no happiness in this world. He just says there's different qualities of happiness with different ramifications and different results. So happiness in the mode of ignorance, the quality of that happiness, it's very degrading. Intoxication is an example. So intoxication is very degrading, but people are intoxicated. In that moment, they're happy. that most of that happiness is coming from forgetfulness of their suffering. So any time happiness is covering your consciousness in a way that you kind of forget who you are and forget your suffering temporarily and that's how you achieve happiness, that's the mode of ignorance. And the mode of passion, the problem with the mode of passion is the nature of happiness in the mode of passion is it's totally self-centered. So as we know, when you're self-centered, you might enjoy the sensual pleasure of that happiness, but when you're self-centered, it creates tremendous dissatisfaction, because when you're just thinking about yourself, you can't satisfy yourself unless it's on the spiritual level. So it's very frustrating because you're doing things to satisfy your senses, but your senses is not yourself, right? And that's why sensual gratification is not satisfying. So when Krishna says it's pleasure in the beginning, poison in the end, sometimes it's not overtly poisonous, it's just like a letdown. Okay, I did that, but then I revert back to my normal state of consciousness, which is not so great. If it isn't so great, then I do something sensual, I get this high, and then I go down, right, back to my normal state of consciousness. Okay, my normal state, if my normal state is not a very high state, then I have to do something sensual to stimulate myself, to give me some pleasure, and then that wears off and I come back. So when Krishna says it becomes poison, in some cases it's not overtly poisonous, like let's say in a bad relationship that turns really sour and there's a lot of suffering, or you do something where you hurt yourself and you suffer, or it causes you to become very sick. It's not necessarily always like that. Sometimes it just leaves you empty, and so you do something to make yourself happy, and then it leaves you empty, and that becomes like the poison, the consequence. Well, it didn't work, and every time I do it, it's great, I like it, but I need it more. It doesn't sustain itself. The nature of addiction, I was studying a little bit about addiction. Addiction is a high. And it doesn't have to be a drug. We can be addicted to many things. And what the psychologists say is we have a normal state of consciousness, which is here, but the addictive substance, whatever it is, could be a substance, could be gambling, could be anything, sex, whatever, riding 100-foot waves. There's a guy that was like riding these huge waves, and he knows when he goes out he could die. I mean, like really huge, scary, dangerous. But he's just like, he's got to do it because it's such a high. Or skiing down a mountain, you could break your legs, break your ankles. So what they say is that the addictive mentality is that the addiction pleasure is up here and your normal level is here. So when you come back to your normal level, it's a kind of suffering. And so you need this addiction. And in fact, somebody was telling me that, if I get this correctly, like people who do something like ride big waves, which is like high adrenaline activity, when they're not doing that, their life's kind of boring and miserable because that was so high on the scale that anything else they do, like going to, let's say, a rock concert, that's not going to equal riding a 50-foot wave. It's just, nothing's going to equal that. There was history of the Hells Angels. Most of the Hells Angels were, I think, had started, I believe, in World War I. They were World War I pilots, or maybe World War II, probably World War I. They were pilots, and flying an airplane is such a height that the only thing that came close to it that they could do was riding motorcycles very fast. And then eventually it evolved into this group of Hells Angels. But initially it wasn't like a bunch of, it was just normal people. It wasn't like a specific kind of person. So that's the idea of addictive behavior. That it's the pleasure, the gratification, the excitement, the level of consciousness that you achieve in that addictive activity is so high that when you go back to normal, it's like you need to get back there. It's so attractive. So you have to go out and find that other 50-foot wave or that substance or that experience. So that's also what Krishna means by it's pleasure in the beginning, poison at the end. The poison is now I'm down here and I want this up here and I'm hankering for this and my normal life is here and it's quite boring. It's not really that great, you know. So that's interesting, isn't it? You know, or maybe you skydive or you do something, whatever, that's extremely sensual. It's actually going to leave you very dissatisfied because nothing else in your life is going to compare with that. Isn't that interesting? And it's going to kind of leave you addicted because, as we said before, Patanjali said that attachment comes from activities which give you pleasure. And if something gives you pleasure, you think about it and you want it. Again, you want to do it again. You want to experience it again, right? Detachment comes from activities which cause you pain. You want to remove yourself from them. So it's kind of interesting because anything you do which gives you pleasure, if it's not something which is good for you, it's going to tend to cause you to become attached to it because it gives you pleasure, right? If the more pleasure it gives you, the more attached you become to it. And then if you're a devotee and you become attached to doing something which isn't good for you, then the pleasure always turns to pain because after you do it, if it takes you away from Krishna consciousness, then naturally you lament. So why did I do that? So I think for us, in a sense, it can, the pleasure to poison ratio can even be greater because the poison is how much something took us away from Krishna. Now that's even more painful. Because if you're not a devotee, it's just pleasure and then it leaves you dry afterwards and you just want to get back to it. But for us, it could be even more of a gap, more intense. Yeah, Cinderella is saying she was diving in the Red Sea. It was so exciting. And then she also quoted Prabhupada as saying, Prabhupada said, you still think you can find happiness in the world, you're an illusion. So, so what Prabhupada means when he describes happiness is he's just saying, if you can find happiness without any inebrities, that's pure. That's a pure state of consciousness. If you think you can find that through material activities, it doesn't happen that way because material pleasure, it exists, but could only exist through one of our senses. That's how we enjoy this world, by seeing something, smelling something, hearing something, touching something, and tasting something. And we can also enjoy the mind through thinking, through speculation, through creativity, through imagination, because the mind is a sense. So when Prabhupada's saying, if you think you can be happy through one of the senses, especially if you're a devotee, this is a problem. Maybe it's a good problem, but it's a problem if you're a devotee, because for a devotee who knows what spiritual pleasure is, it's very difficult to enjoy sensual pleasure because subconsciously you know there's something much higher, and you know this is temporary, and you know that by engaging in something which is temporary, you could have put that time and energy to purifying yourself or elevating yourself in Krishna consciousness. So you know that you've just kind of wasted time and that this pleasure you got is not going to last. It's not the greatest thing. And Krishna consciousness is much greater. Now, someone might say, well, look at, you have to have some pleasure. And it's true, you do. So we're not saying that you don't gratify your senses. So Prabhupada recognized that because we have bodies and we're conditioned souls, we have to gratify our senses, that's for sure. But he always said, gratify it to a degree that doesn't become a problem for your spiritual life. There's a balance there. Eating, sleeping, mating, defending, recreation, and so forth, that has to be regulated. So because we need a little. We need enough to be peaceful. But the point is when you get too much, then you get the poisonous effect after it. And you get let down because you thought, okay, this is going to make me happy, and it didn't. So the point I'm making is that Krishna says there is happiness in different modes of nature. Happiness comes with various consequences, and the happiness comes with various qualities. Now, I've been studying a bit about happiness as it's perceived through modern psychology, or what they call positive psychology. And there's been a lot of studies on what makes people happy. And in all these studies and all the talks that I'm seeing, there's an unstated fundamental principle, is that we as human beings want to be happy, need to be happy, it's good to be happy. And it's just kind of like an unstated obvious, of course. But the problem with all that, which is not being said directly, is that everybody's thinking that, yes, it's good to be happy, but everybody's thinking about how I can become happy. Now, you look at someone like Prahlad Maharaj, he's thinking how everyone else can be happy. And there was a nice statement. There's a very popular teacher. He's written a few books, and he's kind of a bit touching mode of goodness. Maybe he has some Buddhist background. He's in America, and I think was raised in England and America. Now his name's Simon Sinek, and he does a lot of research, and so I get a lot of statistical information because he reads a lot, and I can get a lot to use in my preaching by watching him. And he said something that I really liked. He was talking about how we're becoming more self-absorbed. He was using an example of smartphones, how smartphones are kind of an addiction and a facility for self-absorption, and how many likes did I get for this picture and so forth. So he made a point that even in self-improvement, improving ourselves, there's a whole industry called self-help, whole section of bookstores and libraries on self-help. And he said, but why don't we have a section called Help Others? Which I thought was very nice, because that's the problem with happiness. It can be a very self-absorbed enterprise. Or think, yeah, we should all be happy. Okay, we agree. We should all be happy. Goal of life's be happy. Happiness is the thing we're all looking for. But it can become very, very selfish. It can be very, very me-oriented. And so the fundamental problem is, if something's me-oriented, ultimately, it can't make you happy. It just doesn't work that way. So that's a big problem that I've noticed in that world, even in the self-development world, or even in spiritual teachings. We have to be careful when anybody's learning how to be happy, that happiness doesn't become an enterprise in which it's about me being happy. And as far as you being happy, well, that's your business. That's up to you. I'll be happy in my way, you be happy in your way. Whereas the spiritual consciousness was expressed by Prahlad Maharaj, that I'm happy. Why am I happy? I don't even have to try to be happy. I'm happy because I'm hearing and chanting about you. So for us as devotees, we really, in theory, don't have to make any effort to be happy. We just have to do our sadhana. And as a result of the sadhana, we'll be happy. So that's why spiritualists can think about the happiness of others, because they don't have to, well, if I'm hungry, it's hard to serve you. So if I'm not happy, it's hard for me to go out and make you happy. But if I'm happy, then naturally I can think about your happiness. If I'm not happy, then I'm thinking about my happiness. So I'm so miserable, what could I do to be happy? Let's go to a movie, let's do this, let's do that. I'm always thinking, oh, there's this new product, that'll make me happy, or I like to go here, that'll make me happy, or I don't have a boyfriend or girlfriend, I need one, that'll make me happy, or I live in this place, I need to live in that place. So we're conditioned to think that way. But as you advance in Krishna consciousness, you don't have to find happiness, because the process makes you happy. And, we could tell people, one of the greatest struggles in life, and perhaps one of the greatest causes of suffering, is just the struggle to find happiness, because it's a huge struggle, because unless you develop a higher consciousness, you can never find it. And so you're always having to set up situations that give you temporary pleasure, because you can't find it any other way. And therefore everybody, in that consciousness, everybody becomes very self-centered, isn't it? Yes, it is. You must say, yes, Mahatma Prabhu, you are right. Yeah, because it's in a sense for us, this is all obvious. But for other people, it's not obvious for everyone. Or for some people, they understand it, but they don't know how to elevate their consciousness. Or Maybe they know, but they're too conditioned to material ways of enjoyment and they can't detach. So they're involved in this process of struggling, or we could call struggling to find happiness. It's like it's an effort which goes on daily. What will make me happy? Whereas for a devotee, in theory, a devotee, just by hearing chanting, he's happy in his own consciousness, his own spiritual practice. And that's why he can think about making others happy. And in fact, making others happy makes him happy. So it adds to that equation of his enthusiasm to help others, because he doesn't have to worry about his own happiness. And if I'm preoccupied worrying about my own happiness, how can I worry about other people's happiness? It's like if I'm hungry, how can I serve? So we have a question. A devotee knows the steps from Shraddha to Prema. From what level in the devotee's bhakti begins to realize the happiness that is growing are known as Anandam Buddhi Vardhanam? Well, it's an interesting question, because one of the things that you learn by studying the various levels of devotional service is that the highest level is prema, and next to prema is bhava, and bhava is the first rays of prema, or the first rays of love. But one of the things you learn is that when you come to those levels, it doesn't mean that until you come to that level, you don't experience something of a higher level on a lower level. Well, what it means is when you come to that level, then you're permanently situated on that level. So for example, there's a level which is called ruchi. Ado shraddha, tata sadhu sangha, bhajana kriya, anartha nivritti, nishta, and ruchi. So ruchi is the sixth. Then there's the sakti, there's bhav, and prema. So it's the sixth of 9 stages. And ruchi means taste. And taste for devotional service. The stage of ruchi comes after the stage of nishta. Nishta means steady. And nishta, steadiness, comes after the stage of anartha nivritti. Anartha nivritti means that most of the contamination, or things which are conditioning, or things which would deviate us from Krishna, are gone. And because they're gone, therefore we can be steady. There's, the pullings and pushings of the world have subsided. At least the intensity has excited. I might be aware of the attractions of this world, but the intensity of their pulling, it doesn't have much effect on me. I can say, yes, that's beautiful. Do you want to go there? No, not really. That looks delicious. Do you want to eat it? No, I'm okay. I just eat my khichdi. What about this? What about that? Oh, come look at this, look at that. No, I'm okay. Your stage of nishta means that you're not really pulled. Nishta means steady. It also means faith. But after nishta comes the stage of ruchi. Ruchi means taste. So why does taste come after anartha nivritti and nishta? Because taste for the spiritual can only come when there's sufficient detachment from the material, because your mind and heart and senses aren't dwelling on material things, because you're getting an experience from the spiritual. And you can, in reverse order, you can get that experience from the spiritual because you're not dwelling on the material. You're not hankering for it. There's like sometimes we say, a neem leaf, I don't know if you've ever experienced the taste of a neem leaf. It's extremely bitter. So if you're eating sweet rice or halva or something deliciously sweet, and you put a neem leaf in, then it's going to ruin it. You're going to experience this extremely bitter taste within that sweetness. So take the neem leaf out and you can experience it fully. So ruchi is that position where you can experience nectar and Krishna consciousness, taste, without neem leaves. Before that, there's a little neem. So we're experiencing Krishna consciousness, but there's still some material hankering, and it gives us a little bitter taste. So it's a little bit of a paradox when you consider that to get a taste, ruchi, spiritual taste, you have to detach from the material taste. That's how you get it. And so it's a bit of a paradox, because our conditioned nature is pulling us in to want to enjoy this world. And in our consciousness, in our mind, we think, if I enjoy my senses, that equates to happiness. But if we think that way, we never get to the stage of ruchi. Because ruchi is that stage which is experienced when I'm detached from the sensual level. That's the only way I can experience it. And it's a much higher experience than anything we could get material. But you have to give up the material taste to get the spiritual taste. But like Krishna says in the Gita, once you get it, then you think, okay, I've got it, I've reached it. This is the summit. This material enjoyment can't compare with this. That's your experience. And you think, as Krishna said, having gained this, he thinks there's nothing better. Doesn't get any better than this. And it's sustainable and you don't need external stimuli to sustain it, which is how we should explain this to non-devotees. Everything that I'm talking about today, of course, it may be beneficial for us, but I'm explaining it in a way that I would explain it to people who don't understand this. So we have another question that just popped up. I'm going to see. How come devotees experience little to no? And I just tapped on it and it disappeared. Okay. Now what do we do? How do I get it back? I lost it. I have to hit invitation. Maybe. Invite a few people. I lost the question. So, whoever wrote that question, can you write it again? I actually lost the chat window. Anyway, write your question again. And then, yeah, I lost it. There's a little blue box that came up with your question. And maybe, I don't know. Wait, hold on. No, it means I could write a comment. I'm having fun with all these buttons here. I don't know. Anyway, I lost the question. I lost the chat window. Can somebody just say Haribol? So I want to see if I get back into the chat window. Yeah. So let's, I lost the chat. And you have to chat me to tell me how to get the chat back. Well, let me hit this. No, it didn't work. You get to see all your pictures. That's nice. You can go through and see your pictures. Oh, I got the chat back. Fantastic. Let's see if I can get that question up. I often feel no satisfaction for material things. Yeah. So, okay. So, often feel no satisfaction from material things and spiritual things at the same time. So not a lot of satisfaction. How come devotees experience little to no happiness and satisfaction? If one is doing sadhana, because there's two reasons. Because, well, the obvious reason is we're not Krishna conscious, so we have, if we're not experiencing enough transcendental pleasure, then, and we're renouncing the material pleasure, then we're not replacing the happiness the gratification we used to get materially with something spiritual. So, if one is not experiencing happiness in sadhana, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. This is interesting because this was never my experience as a devotee. From day one, I was experiencing happiness before I was even a devotee, just chanting Hare Krishna. But I think perhaps the difference may have been when I came to Krishna consciousness, I was reading Bhagavad Gita every day. I was chanting every day. I was doing Harinam almost every day. I was getting Sangha. I was getting a lot of Krishna consciousness. And then I moved in the temple. Then it was a full-time program, and I was involved in preaching. So one of the, if you're doing a lot of kirtan, a lot of hearing chanting, a lot of association, you're sharing Krishna consciousness, you will be happy. If you're just doing like a little bit of that here and there, you have to do enough of it to fill yourself up, to be happy. So if you're not happy in Krishna consciousness, then you have to do something more somewhere. Maybe you're not engaged in a way that's giving you satisfaction. Maybe you don't have good enough Sangha. Maybe you need to be doing more to give people Krishna. Maybe your rounds aren't good. Maybe you're not reading enough. Maybe you're doing something that's draining your Krishna consciousness. You have to look at all these things. In a sense, although this kind of could sound contradictory to everything I said previously, but in a sense, endeavoring to become happy in Krishna consciousness through Krishna conscious activities is really fundamental to advancing, because we need a sufficient amount of spiritual, transcendental pleasure within our lives. And then you won't miss the material gratification. It won't interest you. It can't interest you. Krishna consciousness is superior, but you have to get enough of it for that to happen. And if you don't get enough of it and you've given up the material, then what you're describing happens. You're kind of in the middle. You've given up the material, so there's no more sensual stimulus, and then the spiritual is not sufficient enough to replace it, and then you're left with nothing. And then the problem is you start struggling with your senses to control them. If you're actually Krishna conscious, you shouldn't have to struggle to control your senses. It just shouldn't be a need, because you're fulfilled. So Prabhupada wanted us to be